In cloud computing, Platform as a Service, or PaaS, PaaS, is yet another cloud service model. And it really deals with the underlying infrastructure that supports IT services in the cloud. But wait a second, then how is it different than infrastructure as a service? Well, we'll see that in a moment. First of all, it does deal with the underlying infrastructure, but the provisioning is done by the cloud service provider. Unlike infrastructure as a service, where to provision storage or virtual networks or virtual machines, we, the cloud customer, are responsible for provisioning those items. With Platform as a Service, the provisioning of the underlying infrastructure is automatic. It's done by the provider. And so that's why it's often referred to as a managed service. So the Platform as a Service type of service offering is configured by IT sysadmins, or even in some cases, depending on the service, software developers. And like all services in the Microsoft Azure cloud, there are service level agreements for each PaaS offering. So because the cloud service provider is responsible for the underlying infrastructure, the virtual machines that might need to be deployed and up and running to support something like a database, software running within it like database software, the patching of all of that, the operating system and the database software in our specific example, all of that is the responsibility of the CSP, cloud service provider. So what does that leave us as cloud customers to do? Well, imagine that we are talking about deploying a managed service database in the Azure cloud. So we don't deal with the underlying virtual machine or the database software, but what we do as a cloud customer or tenant is we configure that solution. We would create databases and tables and define the details of the data in terms of how it's stored within that environment. So we're responsible for the configuration of the solution and resultant data. But because we don't have to deal with the underlying infrastructure, it's very quick to provision than if we had to manually deploy everything from scratch, in our example, to support a database solution environment running in the cloud. So let's talk in a bit of detail then for a moment about some Azure PaaS offerings. The first of which is Azure Active Directory. It's often just referred to as Azure AD. So what is this? Well, it's a centralized directory service where we can create user accounts and groups and add the users to groups and essentially use that to control resource access, such as to cloud-based apps. So the great thing about this, Azure Active Directory, because it's a PaaS solution, is that there's no network configuration to deploy or manage. I don't have to worry about deploying a virtual network and IP addresses. I don't have to worry about deploying virtual machines and getting the Active Directory software installed and configured. It's handled automatically. However, with this managed solution, Azure Active Directory, there is not support for some things you might be used to already on premises if you're working with Microsoft Active Directory. So there's no support in Azure AD for organizational units or OUs. There's no support for group policy, which you can apply to OUs to, for example, harden or secure the configuration of Windows devices. So if you need full Active Directory control, this is not the solution. If you need OUs and group policy, that type of thing. So if you need that, you would then deploy virtual machines manually as infrastructure as a service within a virtual network, configure DNS settings manually because Active Directory relies on DNS to discover domain controllers. It's more work, but if you need that full configuration control, it's a valid solution outside of PaaS. Another example of PaaS in the Microsoft Azure environment is Azure SQL Database. So this is a managed service, and so that means that as cloud customers, we don't have to provision a network configuration with IP addressing. That's handled automatically. We don't have to deploy virtual machines that will run our SQL database instances. That's handled automatically because, again, it's a managed service. We don't have to install the database software. It's done for us. This is great because it means we can focus on what really matters in this context, which would be to get a database up and running in the cloud, as opposed to spending a lot of effort working with the underlying infrastructure to support what we really need to do. Now, however, if you do need full control of the SQL database environment with every feature available, then you might consider deploying it manually as an IaaS solution. The same way we would consider doing this if Azure Active Directory didn't meet all of our needs, such as not having OUs or group policy. Next, we have Windows Virtual Desktop, which again is an Azure Platform as a Service or PaaS service offering. This allows users to connect over the internet into the Azure cloud to a Windows Virtual Desktop or a specific app that we've made available. So the user would have the impression that they are running Windows in its entirety locally and running apps locally, when really it's just being streamed over the internet because it's actually hosted in Microsoft Azure. That's Windows Virtual Desktop. So it's a managed service. We don't have to manually configure the underlying network configuration. We don't have to manually deploy client-based virtual machines that users will connect to. Instead, what we can do is just select what's called a bundle. And in Windows Virtual Desktop parlance, a bundle is a combination of hardware power, so CPUs, virtual CPUs and RAM, and software, such as whether you want to use a certain version of Windows or maybe even a custom client image that you want to use with Windows Virtual Desktop. You can customize your bundles then. So with Azure Platform as a Service, we can manage the solutions using the Azure portal, using the Azure CLI, PowerShell commandlets, programmatically through REST API calls, or using templates.